Thank you. I'd like to start, with a quick apology. Dr. Sumanis Sunapradata, who was originally supposed to speak today from the Ministry of Education in Indonesia, has unfortunately ended up cancelling at the last minute. And so although I was involved in the case study, I'm not an expert on Indonesia, and so I'll talk you through the main points, but I can't give you the kind of rich contextual depth that we've just had from Daniel and the other speakers we've had so far. Indonesia is, in terms of quality, very much a work in progress, and this is very much the way we've thought of this case study all the way through, that we don't have such clear evidence as we have with Chile, but that we do have some promising initial signs and also a major emphasis on reforms. The case study focuses on the period after the fall of the New Order regime in 1997 and the East Asian crisis, and looks mostly at the reforms which took place in the democratic era which followed, although we do acknowledge the importance of long-term improvements in primary enrollment and in rising literacy rates over a long period of time. The East Asian crisis caused huge amounts of social upheaval and also led to major changes in the structure of the Indonesian political system. There was a big change in the balance of power towards more lower and middle class groups who prioritized education much more strongly than previously, and the creation of a democratic system created strong political incentives for politicians to follow through and pursue these aims, and education has been a major factor in elections in 2004, in 2009, and also in the current elections. And so we see throughout the 2000s a series of very major reform efforts, although what we can see overall in terms of improvements in quality is sort of very initial signs. So if we look here at progress in terms of learning outcomes in PISA, we can see that we have statistically significant improvements in reading over 2000 to 2012 period, which seems to have translated to actually improvements across all socioeconomic deciles. However, for science and mathematics, we have a much more mixed picture. There's some initial gains, but then tapering off in the late 2000s, so that essentially scores at the beginning of the decade and the end of the decade are more or less indistinguishable. So quite a mixed picture in terms of quality. If we look at things in terms of enrollment, Indonesia during the 2000s has recovered primary enrollment to more or less universal levels, and there's also been improvements in primary completion and in retention. In terms of lower secondary enrollment, Indonesia has also performed very well, as you can see here. And similarly, in terms of completion rates for lower secondary, you can see that there's an increase here, and that this also seems to have translated into some narrowing of gaps between different socioeconomic groups, although these gaps are still quite significant. And taking really this increase in lower secondary enrollment and completion together with the relative stability we see in test scores, we think is also a sign of progress, that there hasn't been, as of yet, a huge decrease over the decade, despite the improvements in numbers, and the numbers coming from more marginalized groups. So we identified really, as with the rest of them, 4 main drivers of progress. To some extent, as with Chile, we see a major focus on improving the teacher workforce, an attempt to expand the number of teachers, to recruit a new cadre of more professional teachers, and also to upskill the existing teacher workforce. And this was done through a combination of salary increases to try and overcome the historically low pay and low status that Indonesian teachers had had relative to other civil servants, but also an emphasis on essentially raising the standards which teachers would have to meet. This was done initially through teachers having to have higher levels of degrees in order to teach in schools, and then, but the main area we focus on in our case study is the 2005 teacher law, which introduced a system of teacher certification. Teachers with undergraduate or similar degrees who achieve certain prerequisites in terms of teaching ability and content knowledge could then be certified and would then receive a professional allowance which would essentially double their salary. So this was a fairly major incentive for teachers to upskill and to improve their abilities. This is also accompanied by not only major expansion of funding on the government side, but in terms of teacher salaries, but also an emphasis on expanding colleges to ensure that teachers could get degrees, with the aim being that all teachers would be certified by 2015. And there have been challenges, and actually all of these different drivers, there are nuances, which I'll go into if there's time at the end. I mean, essentially it seems to have had success in terms of expanding the number of teachers. Pupil-teacher ratios have fallen significantly for primary and lower secondary levels. There's also statistics indicating that teacher qualifications over the decade have also improved. A higher proportion now have bachelor's or postgraduate degrees than previously, although the links from this to education quality still haven't been entirely worked out. Specifically on the certification program, impact evaluations have suggested that teachers once certified are far less likely to have second jobs, and that rates of absenteeism have fallen. But we're still awaiting much of the final evaluations in terms of the impact on student learning outcomes. So this is very much an area still to watch. Secondly, and closely linked, is the question of curriculum and teaching methodology. There's been a shift from a very content-based curriculum to a more competency-based curriculum, and a shift away from rote learning and teacher-centered teaching to more student-centered methods. And evaluations have shown that where these methodologies have been put in place, there have been improvements in student learning outcomes, but the major question is ensuring that teachers do actually adopt these methodologies. The third factor really has been the major decentralization of the education system, which took place in the very early 2000s, and the combination of this with significant channeling of funds to district and regional governments, but also to the school level, with the position of sort of very large capitation grants, which increased the resources available at the school level, but also gave them considerable discretion over how they were spending these funds. Some of this was initially to compensate for the removal of user fees for primary and secondary level, but it's also been a fairly major increase in funding over the top of that as well. And there are suggestions that in some cases evaluations have found this is linked to improvements in learning outcomes, but also considerable improvements in enrollment rates and student completion rates. Although again, there's nuances around this as well. The final factor which I'll come to here is really one of the things which has enabled all of the rest of these programs to be put in place, which is the major increase in government spending which has been channeled into the education system. In 2002, there was a constitutional commitment that the Indonesian government would spend at least 20% of its budget on the education system. This was finally achieved in 2009, where you can see the little star there. And this represents in real terms an increase in between 2001 and 2011 of more or less a tripling of the amount of money which was going into the education budget. So these are really quite significant sums overall. And alongside this, we see a channeling as well of funds towards more marginalized groups, the use of scholarships to try and reduce further the cost of education, remove barriers to access, and also a series of conditional cash transfers. And again, some of this has been linked to very initial improvements in learning outcomes, but the major impact seems to have been around retention, access, and completion rates. So taking these four factors together in brief seem to be the major drivers which we've found so far. And just to go very quickly into the challenges here, as with most of them, there's still issues around school-to-work transitions. There are major questions around access and take-up rates for early childhood education. The government was hoping to have a 75% enrollment rate in early childhood education by 2015, but it doesn't look like this is going to be achieved at current rates. And finally, the last two here. As with Chile, there's still significant issues around equity. In the case of Indonesia, this is particularly a major issue between different regions. Indonesia is a vast and highly diverse country. Pupil-teacher ratios range significantly between different areas, and a recent World Bank estimate put it at, I think, 17% of the teaching workforce would have to move school or region in order for pupil-teacher ratios to meet government standards across all schools. And you can see here that there's major gaps in enrollment for secondary education between these different areas, and if we looked at primary enrollment and primary completion, you'd also see similar patterns. Also, in terms of absolute learning outcomes, while we have seen some improvements, Indonesia is still lagging behind both the very basic PISA benchmarks. Its students are very far behind that, And although these are measured against OECD nations, if we look at the results which Indonesia received in the most recent PISA and compare them against its neighbours in the region, you can see that there's still a considerable amount of ground to be made up there as well. So we are seeing improvements, but in absolute terms, there's still a long way to go. And the final question really is about cost effectiveness and the sustainability of the reforms. Do we need to wind up here? Or?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Indonesia's political system has meant that there's considerable difficulties in ensuring that the money is being well spent, and a lot of questions about sort of how effective some of the certification reforms have been. But thank you.
Great. Thank you, Joe.